Hello everyone, and welcome to another dev video of the Stride game engine. In this video, I want to demonstrate a work in progress of the next component for the Spline toolset, which is going to be the Spline mesh component. So as you can see here, I've opened up a new scene called Spline Mesh, and I've created a spline that's going to represent a racetrack. And as you can see, I have all the spline render or debug options enabled so that it visualizes that particular spline. And I've already displayed some cool looking cars, which I did not make. I downloaded those from a website which offered them for free. But now let's create an actual racetrack. So as you can see, I have this Spline racetrack entity here, and it has these sub nodes with the Spline node component. And I have the Spline component here already attached, which is why we see this spline. And if we click on add component and we either go to splines, we can now have the spline mesh. Of course, I could have just typed that, but let's select the spline mesh. And the first thing that we need to do is reference the spline component, which is our racetrack. And then we have a drop-down list here, which is going to be extended later on. But for now, I have a box and a plane mesh. And I also have a cylinder or cylindrical, no, that's not the right word. Well, a cylinder-esque shape as a primitive shape, which you can select as well. But for a road, all we need to have is a plane mesh. And as you can see, that plane mesh is being created. One of the open bugs I currently have is this really odd line here. That's one of the final things that I need to fix. And since this line is, or this spline is a loop, there's also something is going wrong in that final stretch, that last node. But if I move my spline just a little bit, then that last node is being corrected. So I guess I'll just have to do one last update once I'm creating the spline. And this is already creating a cool looking mesh for us. We can also scale that down a little bit. Right now, the event triggers are not entirely working for this option if we change anything here. But if we move our spline, then we can adjust that quite easily. It looks like that scale wasn't really working properly. Let's do 2 then. Nope, I've broken something. Oh, well, I have another bug here. Looks like when I change the scale, I'm also offsetting it to the actual spline position, which is of course not the thing we want. So, as I said, work in progress. But let's say that this is exactly the mesh size that we want to have. Then we also have this option for a material. And I went ahead and made a road material. So if I have my spline mesh component selected and I drag in this road material, let's update my spline for a little bit. We already have this cool looking road being displayed in our scene. And of course, we can still adjust the positions of our spline. We can make it twirl into itself, move it slightly higher, tweak all of its settings as you would normally with the spline. But yeah, this is already looking kind of cool, and I think we can make some real cool stuff with this. So next up is, of course, another type of spline mesh, and that is the cube spline or box spline, depending on how you want to call it. This is a non-looping spline, as you can see. And if I select that one, you can see that I've selected the box type. I've also chosen the extra option here, which is to close off the ends. I can, if I want to save those edges, if I don't want to have those extra vertices and faces, then I can simply disable that close end checkbox. But otherwise, you will just get them in your scene. And then finally, also an example of the looped spline. As you can see, I have the exact same bug here where the final stretch is not being rendered properly. But if I just update it manually here, you can see I have a nice and cool looking a box spline or box mesh along this spline. I have a nice texture attached to it as well. Closing of the ends doesn't really matter here since it's, well, not visible if you're looping your spline. But anyway, that's what I wanted to show thus far. The cool spline mesh component. Let's also run this for a second. We will probably see that bug where the spline mesh is not rendered properly when the scene is first loaded. So if I open up that particular scene, our cars, which have a spline traverser, by the way, they travel along this spline nicely. And that's already looking kind of cool. And of course, the spline has this broken final segment, which should be fairly easy to fix. And everything else is looking kind of cool. So for the next video, you will see that this bug here is fixed, as well as updating all the settings in the properties, which should trigger an update on the existing spline, as well as some other spline mesh types. And the first one on my list is the cylindrical spline mesh. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around for the next video.